"He is not coming." The groom's brother said it aloud, standing in the chancel of a church that held 140 people, because he had been too great a fool to read the note to himself first. The Duke of Brackwater heard the paper shake in the young man's hand from 6 pews away, and thought with a cold and useless clarity that the whole of the next hour was now going to happen whether anybody wished it or not. The organ had stopped. Someone at the back laughed and turned it into a cough. At the altar rail stood Miss Amabel Ray in a gown of white muslin that had plainly been her mother's and had plainly been let out at the seams by her own hand, with a wreath of hawthorn in her hair because hothouse flowers were beyond her. She had been standing there 11 minutes. Ingram had counted them in the way a man counts the fall of a hammer. "Read the rest of it," she said. The brother's ears went scarlet. "Miss Ray, I do not think you have read the first line to the parish," said Amabel. "You may as well read them the second." So he read it. Mr. Perrin Ashcombe begged to inform Miss Ray that he had, upon reflection, formed an attachment elsewhere, that he was at that hour on the North Road with Miss Coralie Danby, whose fortune stood at £40,000, and that he trusted Miss Ray, whose sense he had always admired, would understand. The whisper went up the nave like a draught under a door. Ingram watched it travel. He watched Lady Mersey's fan come up, and old Mrs. Fell lean sideways to say the word she had been saving all morning, and he watched the bride's aunt begin to weep, loudly and quite uselessly, in the front pew, and he watched Amabel Ray, who did not weep. She stood with her hands folded and her chin level, and she looked at the east window as though she had been asked to admire it, and Ingram understood that she was giving them all the time they needed to be finished, so that she might walk out through the quiet part instead of the loud part. He had known her for 19 years and had never once given her more than the courtesy a duke gives his land agent's daughter. Her father, Josiah Ray, had kept Brackwater's books, mended its cottages, argued with its tenants and been loved by them, and had died the previous spring with his boots by the fire. Amabel had been born in the agent's house under the beech trees at the park gate. She had never lived a mile from Brackwater in her life, and in 5 minutes more this parish would have decided, for the remainder of that life, exactly what she was. Ingram stood up. He was aware, dimly, of his aunt's hand closing on his sleeve, and of 140 faces turning. He walked up the aisle without hurrying, because a man who hurries is a man who may be stopped, and he stopped at the altar rail and looked down at the crown of hawthorn and the seams led out by hand. "Miss Ray, marry me instead." The church made no sound at all. Amabel raised her eyes to his. They were grey and entirely dry, and there was nothing in them of gratitude, which he found he respected enormously. She said. Behind him, someone's prayer book hit the floor. "I will not be rescued in front of these people, Your Grace," she said, low and steady. "In an hour they will have made a story of it, and in the story I will be the girl who was left in the morning and taken up in the afternoon like a glove. I would sooner be pitied than be that." "You are right," Ingram said. She blinked. "You are entirely right, and I have done it badly, and I have no talent for doing this sort of thing in public." He put his hands behind his back. "So I will say the rest badly too. In 10 minutes this room will decide what you are, and it will hold to that verdict for 30 years, and neither you nor I will ever be able to shift it. I would rather the verdict were Duchess. That is my reason. It is not a good one, but it is a true one, and it is the only one I mean to give in front of 140 people." Amabel Ray looked at him for a long moment. Somewhere at the back a woman hissed at her neighbour to be quiet. "There is a difficulty," said the vicar, wretchedly. "The licence names Mr. Ashcombe. I cannot." "Then it will not be today," Ingram said, without taking his eyes from her. "Banns. In this church, from this pulpit, 3 Sundays, beginning the next. Read in my name and in hers, before every soul in this parish." He let that sit. "And on any of those 3 Sundays, Miss Ray, you may stand up and forbid it, and I will hand you the pen myself, and no man here will ever hear a word of complaint from me." She was quiet so long that he thought she would refuse again. Then she said, 3 weeks is a very long time to be looked at." "It is," said Ingram. "I have found nothing shortens it." Amabel laughed. It was a small, cracked, astonished sound, and it went into that church like light through a keyhole, and half the parish never forgave her for it. She put her hand on his arm. They walked out together past the fans and the open mouths, past the aunt who had stopped weeping in order to stare, and out into the churchyard where the rooks were going over, and Ingram's carriage stood at the lych gate with its door open and the horses steaming in the cold. At the gate she stopped and turned round and looked back at the church door. "You will want to know," she said, "whether I loved him. I will not ask it." I did not. She said it as though she were reading a figure out of a ledger, plainly, without excuse. He asked me in October, and I said yes, because my father was dead and the agent's house goes with the agent's post and your steward's man wants it by Michaelmas. I have been perfectly clear-eyed about the whole business for 7 months, your grace, which is why I did not cry. Her mouth went unsteady for the first time. I should like it understood that I did not cry. It was noticed, Ingram said, by everyone in that building. He handed her into the carriage and shut the door, and stood a moment in the churchyard with his hat in his hand, while his own hied an unfamiliar and inconvenient noise, and then he got in after her and told the coachman to drive on. He put her back in her father's house at the park gate, with her aunt for propriety and 2 of his own servants for comfort, and told the steward that no man was to speak of Michaelmas again in his hearing. Then began 3 weeks that Ingram would afterwards count among the strangest of his life. He had expected to spend them managing a scandal. Instead he found himself, most mornings, in the small parlour of the agent's house with the beach light coming green through the window, being told things about his own land that he had not known in 19 years. "Cold Harbour will not drain," Amabel said on the second morning, turning her father's ledger round so that he could see. "It has not drained since the year of the fever. Your surveyor tells you it is the clay." "It is not the clay, it is that the culvert under the lane was stopped when the new lane was laid, and my father wrote to the estate office about it 4 times, and here are the 4 copies, and here is where he stopped writing." "Why did he stop?" "Because a duke's office does not answer an agent," she said without heat. He was not bitter about it. "I am a little." Ingram read the 4 letters. Then he read the tenant's book and the rentals and the notes in a small round hand in the margins that were plainly not Josiah Ray's, because Josiah Ray had been dead a year, and the entries ran to the previous Friday. "Who has been keeping these since your father died?" Amabel's colour rose for the first time since the church. There was nobody else who knew where the boundary stones were, she said. "I did not take a penny for it." "That," said Ingram, "was an error on your part, and I intend to correct it." He walked home the long way that day, through Cold Harbour, where the water lay grey in the ruts, and he stood there for some while in the wind, a duke in a good coat, looking at a stopped culvert and thinking about a girl who had gone on doing a dead man's work for a year, because nobody had thought to tell her to stop. The banns were read on the first Sunday, and the church was fuller than at Christmas. They were read on the second Sunday, and Lady Mersey came 30 miles to hear them. On the Wednesday before the third Sunday, Perrin Ashcombe came back. Ingram was told of it in the stable yard and walked round to the front of the house, and found the young man already out of his chaise, hat in hand, and Amabel standing on the gravel with a basket of quinces on her arm, and every window of the servants' hall quietly full of faces. The story came out of Ashcombe in a rush. Mr. Danby had overtaken them at Carlisle. There had been no marriage. Miss Danby had been carried home, and her father had said certain things, and now Ashcombe's own father had said certain things, and the whole affair had been a madness, a fever, a moment's folly, and he had thought of nothing on the road south but Amabel's face in that church. "I am here to ask you to forgive me," he said. Before Sunday, Ingram did not move and did not speak. It was not his to answer, and he had learned in 3 weeks that she did not require assistance. Amabel set the basket down on the step. "Mistress Ashcombe," she said, "you have not wronged me half so much as you suppose. You told me the truth about yourself in the only language you had. Most women are obliged to wait years to learn it, and pay for the lesson with their whole lives. I had it in a note in 11 minutes, standing up." She looked at him quite kindly, which Ingram thought was the hardest thing she could have done. "I am obliged to you. I am not going to pretend to be more wounded than I am, and I am not going to marry you." Ashcombe's mouth worked. "You cannot mean to have him. You will be laughed at. They are saying you were taken up like you will be looked at for the rest of your life." "Yes," said Amabel, "by everyone." including, "I find I prefer it to not being looked at all." Ingram said one thing then, and only one. "There is a chaise at your back, Mr. Ashcombe, and this time you may use it going the other way." They were married on the third Sunday in that same church, in the same white muslin, because she would not hear of a new gown while there was nothing wrong with the old one, and the hawthorn was over, so she carried beech leaves out of her father's garden. The parish came in such numbers that they stood in the aisles. Ingram found that he did not mind them in the least. That night, when the house had gone quiet, he told her the thing he had not said in the church. "You believe I stood up out of pity," he said. "I want it understood that I did not." She was sitting by the fire in the long room with her hair down, and she turned her head. 19 years ago, Ingram said, in the fever year, this house emptied. My father was dead in the spring, and I took the fever in the autumn, and everyone who could go went, which was sensible of them. I was 3 weeks in the blue room, and I was not expected to keep. And every morning of those 3 weeks somebody came and sat on the floor of the passage outside my door, where she was forbidden to be, and read me the estate book aloud through 2 inches of oak, rents, repairs, which so had farrowed, whether Ford End had got his roof on. Amabel had gone very still. "I was 11, she said. "You were 11, and I was 22, and there was nothing in the world to hold on to but the sound of a child telling me that Ford End had got his roof on." He looked into the fire. "I never thanked you. It did not seem the sort of thing a duke could mention. So I said nothing for 19 years, and let your father grow old in my service, and let his letters go unanswered. And then I sat in a pew and watched a man leave you at an altar. His voice was not quite even. I did not stand up out of pity, Amabel. I stood up because I had been silent once already, and I could not do it twice." She crossed the room and knelt by his chair and put her hands over his, and neither of them said anything for a long while, and the fire went down, and in time he lifted her hand and kissed it, and the candles were put out. The culvert under the lane at Cold Harbour was opened before Lady Day, and the field carried a crop that year for the first time since the fever. The estate books were kept openly in the small parlour off the great hall, in a round hand, and the tenants learned to knock there first and at the estate office not at all, and the county said what the county says, and grew bored of saying it, and found other things. On the first anniversary of that Sunday, Amabel came upon a folded paper in her husband's pocket-book, worn soft at the creases, 3 lines long. "Why on earth do you keep this?" she said. Ingram took it from her and put it back where it had been. "Because a man ought to keep the only letter," he said, "that ever did him a kindness."